So we were talking about the conferences held at the city of Passau after the Protestants attacked the city of Innsbruck, or at least they approached it, and Charles V did not have the forces to repel them. They entered into negotiations, which resulted in an agreement known as the Treaty of the Public Peace. And they concluded it, and despite the protests of Pope Julius III. The chief clauses of it were that the Landgrave Frederick of Hesse, a prisoner in the hands of the emperor, would be restored to instant freedom, that a Diet of the Empire would be assembled within 6 months to determine the means of settling all differences in religious matters, either by a general or national council, or by conferences between the two parties, or by an ordinary diet. That the deliberations of the Diet would be received according to the judgment of a commission composed equally of Catholics and Protestants. You can see why the Pope is objecting to these terms. Until the complete pacification, both religious shall keep their former rights, and entire freedom of conscience, and a perfect equality. That Ferdinand, brother to the Emperor and King of the Romans, and his son Maximilian, would solemnly pledge themselves to give due weight to all the complaints of the German nation against the violation of its liberties. That all troops on both sides were to be at once disbanded and a general amnesty proclaimed. So, yeah, definitely something that the Pope is not going to like. He in fact protest against it. So that was the Treaty of Public Peace, as it was called. Treaty of the Public Peace, yes.
Father, you said that the Diet that they want to be held to reconcile everybody would be presided by the people.
Yes, there would be, that its deliberations would be received according to the judgment of a commission which would be composed equally of Catholics and Protestants. That's not going to turn out well. So, terrible idea. But they concluded this anyway because they really didn't have any other options. And that doesn't make it acceptable, but that's why they did it. But a few months after this, Charles V sent the imperial crown and scepter, but with the Prince of Orange, to his brother Ferdinand I. After that, so he gives up the signs of the imperial power, and then after that sailed to the coast of Biscay, where he buried himself in the monastic seclusion of Yuste in Extremadura. So he puts himself into a monastery. Charles V, he's done with being emperor now. So of course he goes from being one of the most, if not the most powerful man in the world, to entering a monastery. He's just tired of being a civil ruler. So after he entered this monastery, he was seized with a rather strange desire to witness his own funeral, which he in fact arranged. So he had a tomb erected at his own request in the chapel of the monastery, to which his attendants and the monks proceeded in procession with all of the markings of a funeral, and he himself followed wrapped in a shroud. So he's doing his own funeral while he's still alive. It's a little bit strange, but that's what he's doing. A coffin had been prepared in which he was solemnly laid, and the office of the dead was chanted. He joined his voice with those who were singing it. So he's in the coffin, but he's still singing it. At the end of the ceremony, the coffin was sprinkled with holy water. The crowd departed, and the doors of the chapel were closed. So it was after that he got out of the coffin and went back to his room. But then he actually did die not long after that. He entered that monastery in 1556, and he died in 1558. So you probably knew that his days were numbered at that point. He was aging, and probably his health was declining and everything, but he wanted to see his own funeral, so he had that. So Protestantism is making certain advances in Germany. Of course, it's already in huge proportions, the extent of the revolution there, but there was a happy turn of events in England, although it would prove to be rather short-lived. The Catholic faith was actually restored to England after the death of King Edward VI, who was one of Henry VIII's children. He died in 1553, Edward VI, after reigning for 6 years. He was always in poor health, Edward VI. His reign was devoted to establishing in his kingdom the schism, which was introduced by Henry VIII. So he was very much the son of his father. But it turns out that the Princess Mary, who was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, was much more like her mother than her father. And she was the one who, after the death of Edward VI, ascended the throne. So Mary Tudor. And then the way that's spelled, for anybody who doesn't know. Does anybody know yes? It's 1553, the day that Edward VI died, or the year that Edward VI died. Not necessarily the same day, but the same year. So does anybody know who the first Tudor king of England was? Anybody study history? Yes. Henry VII. Yes, Henry II was long before. Yes, it was Henry VII was the first Tudor king. Yes, he became the King of England after, anybody know which conflict? Yes.
War of the Roses?
Yes, all the Wars of the Roses. There were quite a few of them, and extremely confusing. Anybody ever study the Wars of the Roses? Yeah. Yeah, they're confusing, right? Extremely. I met one of the memorable moments from it was one of the people involved fell into the hands of his enemies, and he was given a choice of they're going to put him to death, but they gave him the choice of how to be executed, and he asked to be drowned in a barrel of wine. So that's what they did. Yes. Probably a lot worse. It's probably why he chose that one, because it was less unpleasant than the others, perhaps. That's the kind of thing that went on during those wars. And they still, to this day, they find, though found fairly recently, I believe, they found a mass grave of soldiers who had died, and examining the skeletons that were left behind, they were able to determine that there was a lot of butchery going on in the battles of that war. It was particularly gruesome. So Mary Tudor ascends the throne. Again, it's that's the end result of maybe not exactly the end result, but Henry goes through so many wives, among other reasons, because he wants a male heir. And then what ends up happening is that two of his daughters end up on the throne, one after the other. The first of whom was the child that he originally wanted to be considered illegitimate. So she ascends the throne. Her arrival in London apparently being a triumph, so she was actually welcomed, and it wasn't like she was forced on the country unwillingly. Of course, she had been brought up a good Catholic, and she retained that. The Parliament, which had been very servile under the princes who had favored the schism, in other words, Henry VIII and Edward VI, was as prompt now to second a Catholic reign in the kingdom. So you can just see people go very easily swayed in one direction or another. They go. Most people went along with Henry VIII, and then with the continuation of that agenda under Edward VI. But now Mary comes in, and they've all of a sudden they're repentant now. So the Parliament very quickly revoked all the laws which had been passed under Edward VI. It annulled the divorce formerly pronounced between Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, declaring that union alone lawful and valid. So, for the moment anyway, vindication of that. Of course, they have to say that at the moment, if Mary's going to reign over the kingdom, they can't very well say that their monarch was born illegitimately. So they have to go back on what they said earlier when they were under the thumb of Henry VIII. And when they said, oh yes, that was invalid, it was an incestuous union, that was invalid. And now they're saying, no, that was valid and lawful. Everything's okay now. But that's what they have to say in the moment. So she just, with a view to securing the succession in her family, she determined to marry, and then did in fact marry Philip II, King Philip II of Spain, who was the son and heir of Charles V, who had already been married once. His first wife had died, and was the father of several children already. So Philip II was married about 4 times, all of them validly. One wife after another would die. And Mary Tudor was his second wife. So as unusual as it is to talk about kings having multiple wives validly, that was in fact the case with Philip II. So it was certainly from a political point of view, that was a successful union. It would bring upon under the same domination, the greater part of the Catholic world, and of course consolidate Mary's throne in England, being allied obviously very closely then with Spain, that was going to secure her throne. And even when Mary was first coming to power, there was a certain Lady Jane Grey, who was great granddaughter of Henry VII. We don't have to go into all of the politics of that, but she was like 16 or 17 years old, but she was claiming the throne, and she ended up being executed by the orders of Mary, as I read. But anyway, there was, even when Mary was first coming in, that took place. So marrying Philip II ensured that there would be, of course, not only the political heft of having an alliance with Spain, but also all the military power of Spain, which was there was at the time. So yes, Lady Jane Grey suffered capital punishment, so she was executed for her part in the revolt. And the marriage of Philip II and Mary was celebrated with quite remarkable magnificence. So really, you can see that England is really embracing now the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, who at one point they had all denounced as being illegitimate. They're now very much embracing it and welcoming her marriage to the King of Spain, and then consenting to the execution of the woman who was challenging that claim. So they're very much embracing the return of the faith to England, for the moment, anyway. And then our author, Darras, again quotes William Cobbett, whom we've talked about before. But Cobbett says that Mary, on ascending the throne, gave her first thoughts to the restoration of that religion, under the influence of which the kingdom had been so happy and so great for so many ages, and since the abolition of which it had known nothing but discord, disgrace, and misery. And also the chief obstacle of this work of restoring England to the church came from those who currently held property which once had belonged to the church and been stolen, confiscated, seized, despoiled by Henry VIII and redistributed to his own people. They had been enriched by the plunder of the bishoprics and monasteries, and now 18 years after the fact, Mary wants to give all the church property back to the church, and people oppose that. So that's the greatest obstacle. And they did put up in a fight there and prevented her from implementing her plans to the extent that she wanted. So greed is the main obstacle at this point. And also it was just difficult because having been then taken and given to other people, divided and subdivided, so it was perhaps difficult to get all of the different people who owned what had formerly been church property to get them to give it back and then return it to the church subsequently. So Cobbett also says that now it was fully proved to the world, and now this plundered nation, which had been reduced to the greatest misery by the so-called Reformation, saw as clearly as they saw the light of day that all those who had abetted the Reformation, that all the railings against the Pope, that all the accusations against the monks and nuns, that all the pretenses of abuses in the Catholic Church, that all the confiscations, sackings, and bloodshed, that all of these, from first to last, had proceeded from the love of plunder. Because now the two houses of Parliament, who had only about 3 or 4 years before established Cranmer's Church, and had declared it to be the work of the Holy Ghost, these same pious Reformation men, having first made a firm bargain to keep the plunder, confessed that they had been guilty of a most horrible defection from the true church, professed their sincere repentance for their past transgressions, and declared their resolution to repeal all the laws enacted in prejudice of the Pope's authority. So that's what they're saying now that a Catholic monarch is back on the throne. So the churches were given back to Catholic worship. First, of course, they would have to undergo all the ceremonies dealing with the fact they'd been desecrated by non-Catholic worship. But then they were subsequently restored to the Catholic, to the sacred liturgy of the church. Married priests were removed from their livings, which was to the great satisfaction of the people, evidently, who had witnessed with pain the abolition of ecclesiastical celibacy. The bishops deposed by Cranmer were restored to their sees. The apostate prelate himself was imprisoned on a charge of high treason, and soon after condemned to the scaffold, which he deserved for his numerous crimes. That was in 1556. So, although I suppose I should specify that talking about Philip II having been the King of Spain, it seems that at that point, when he actually married Queen Mary, that he hadn't quite ascended to the throne of Spain yet. Though I can still check the dates on that, but that's what seemed to be the case. And also, according to what I've read about Cranmer's death, yes, he was executed during the reign of Mary, Queen Mary, that he had on his person at that moment 2 declarations of faith, one which he actually held to, including the heresies that had been introduced during the reign of Edward VI, and another of the Catholic faith, that his resolution was to pull out if at that moment it would prevent him from being executed. So, but he became famous for, when he found that wasn't going to be the case, he pulled out the one that he actually held to and proclaimed that as he was being executed, or just before he was executed. So he was held up as, of course, as like a martyr of the Anglican Church subsequently in future years, future decades, and down the centuries. But when you consider that he had a Catholic profession of faith on his person as he was doing that, if it would save his life, takes away whatever pretenses of heroism there might be to that. So the sacrifice of the Mass during the reign of Queen Mary is, of course, again being celebrated throughout the whole extent of the kingdom, while the needy and wretched were no longer condemned to the brand of infamy and servitude for their misfortune, which they had been according to the laws of Henry VIII. So essentially, Henry VIII made it, of course, stealing all the property from the church, which ran charitable institutions. There was nobody taking care of those who were truly in need. And in fact, he passed laws against beggars and other poor people. Yes.
Who was the monarch that preceded Queen Mary? Edward the Sixth.
Edward the Sixth. Yes. He died in 1553. And Mary Tudor succeeded him. His half sister, I suppose. So again, also, and it's all still from Cobbett, all seemed to promise that the abyss of revolution was now closed up, that England would be England again, and that hospitality and charity would return. So remember, though, that Cobbett never actually himself became a Catholic. Now, how he could say all those things and write that whole book on the horrors of the Protestant Reformation, specifically England and Ireland, and not himself become a Catholic is mind-boggling on the face of it. But he never did. In fact, he proclaimed in his work that all my parents were Protestant and I will die a Protestant myself, but while essentially lamenting everything about the fact that Protestantism exists at all in the first place. Must have been an emotional connection or family ties and other motives. But that's what he himself said. So, Cardinal Pole, remember, whose mother had been brutally executed during the reign of Henry VIII, for the faith, actually, for no other reason than she was a Catholic. He had presided at the opening of the Council of Trent and was still on the continent at the time of Mary's accession. So Pope Julius III named him apostolic legate in England, since it was now safe for him to return, so he sends Cardinal Pole back to England to be the apostolic legate there. The session of Parliament, which was to consecrate the official reestablishment of the Catholic religion, was opened in November of 1554 with a grand procession of the two houses, closed by the king on horseback and the queen in a litter. So Philip II was, for the length of time that Mary Tudor was alive, he was considered to be the king of England, actually. So, but later on he would, in fact, anybody know what he would do later on with regard to England? Anybody know? I mean, anybody ever heard of the Spanish Armada? Anybody not heard of that? You've not heard of that? You've heard of that, okay. You've not, okay, well, the Spanish Armada, yeah, we'll see it later on. It occurs later on, but essentially it was an enormous fleet that Philip II put together for the sake of invading England and overthrowing Elizabeth II later on. So he went from being, at least in a title, King of England, to putting together a force to invade England. But he was only considered to be King of England. And what exactly his powers were, it's not entirely clear. It seems that, well, for one thing, he was considered a joint ruler with Mary. Now, how exactly that worked, they just made all decisions together. It's not entirely clear how they made all their decisions, but it seems to have worked to some degree anyway, while she was alive. Of course, once she died, then Philip had to give up all of his title, the King of England, and everything that went with it, and go back to being a King of Spain only. But everything that happened during the reign of Queen Mary in England is always attributed to her. So whether he was even there all the time, it would seem not, that she ran things most of the time. But everything that happened during the reign of Queen Mary is attributed to her. Like, that's why she's called by Protestants Bloody Mary, because she executed Protestants who were criminal in their obstinacy. You have a question?
Yeah. So what exactly, I understand the marriage was dissolved with Mary's death, but was that the cause of this loss of power over England? Or
Yes, it was agreed that he would have the title of the King of England and everything else that went with that, as long as she was alive. So she was older than he was, and She was the Queen of England, and she married him, so he became King of England. But that was agreed that if she were to die first, that he would have to give up all the titles and everything that went with it. So something of an odd arrangement, and at the end they shared power, it seems. And so it seems like a lot of marriages, like spouses can't agree to run the house. You would have spouses agreeing to run a kingdom. I guess it was a different century though. So, and they all, of course, given their characters, it would probably have worked out. But that was the arrangement. As unusual as it was, that was the arrangement. But again, it ended with the death of Mary. So while that was going on, there's this grand procession of the Houses of Parliament with the King and Queen involved in it. The Parliament passes this act, which was repealing the banishment, essentially, of Cardinal Pole. Of course, Henry VIII had gotten rid of him. He would have executed him if he could have. If he executed his mother, he would have executed the cardinal himself. But in any case, they're repealing any sanctions that were against him. And while that was going on, noblemen, various gentlemen, had gone to Brussels to conduct the cardinal to England. So they were sent to meet him, bring him back to the country with all the dignity befitting a cardinal. On the 29th of November, we're still in 1554 here, the two houses addressed a petition to the king and queen in which they expressed their deep regret at having been guilty of defection from the church and prayed to their majesties, who had not participated in the sin, to intercede with the Holy Father for their forgiveness and for their readmission into the fold of Christ. So they're really going all in on this repentance. Of course, we'll see whether or not they stick to it, but at the moment, they're going all in on it. So the next day, the queen being seated on the throne with the king on her left, so she's holding the place of honor there. The legate, though at a greater distance on her right, the Lord High Chancellor, whose name was Bishop Gardiner, spelled with D-I-N-E-R, read the petition. So they're very formally then requesting to be readmitted into the Catholic Church. So the king and queen then spoke to the legate, and he, after a speech of some duration, gave, in the name of the Pope, to the Houses of Parliament and to the whole nation, the absolution for the sin of schism, essentially. And they elicited an enthusiastic response from Parliament, from the Houses of Parliament. So that made England, again, officially a Catholic country once more. And Julius III still wanted, it hadn't been brought about, he still wanted to, of course, restore the property of the church in that kingdom. But it seems that there was, given the fact that so many people had profited from the spoliation of the church during the Henry VIII and the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI, that there was enough difficulty. They were able to posit enough obstacles that the monarchs were not even, again, it was Mary was mostly the one doing it, but she was not able to return, certainly not all of the property of the church to the church. So, disappointment for the Pope that wasn't brought about. But still, there was, obviously, it's a huge improvement of the state of affairs in general that if you have a whole kingdom returning to the church. So she wanted to, she made every effort to restore all church and abbey lands to the church. Certainly all the ones in her own possession she gave back. Anything that had been taken for the crown specifically, she gave back to the church. But everything that had been then distributed and then subdivided amongst various nobles and whoever else got a hold of them wasn't so easy. She restored Westminster Abbey, the monastery at Greenwich. Anybody know how to spell Greenwich besides Aiden? Anybody? Yes. Greenwich. Yes. Well, does anybody know how to spell it? Yes. Yes. It has. Yes. 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 Right. So the way it's written is this. Yes. Let's see. Sorry. There's a W in there. Yes. Greenwich. That's how that's pronounced. Yes, it is the point of zero longitude also. So anyway, there's a there's a monastery there that she gave back to the church. And the reason that's considered zero longitude is because people involved in the calculations of those things happen to be there. So they said, we're going to make the city that we are in the center of it all. That was how they decided that. So that's why Greenwich time is so important. And then also the monastery of the Blackfriars in London. Anybody know who the Blackfriars are or were? Anybody? Yes. Dominicans, actually. Actually, they're Dominicans because they wore a black. It's true, the Dominicans have a white habit, but apparently they had a black overcoat that they would wear whenever they went out in public, a black cloak. And so they became known as the Blackfriars because of that. The friars who wore black. Whenever they were seen in public, they were wearing black over their white habits. And then she also gave back a number of hospitals to the church, to the care of the church, which she liberally endowed. So she restored all of the church property that was in certainly her immediate power to restore, and gave it back, not stripped bare either. Again, she liberally endowed them. So again, going back to quoting Cobbett again, William Cobbett, such was the queen, according to him, upon whom so many English writers have bestowed the epithet of bloody. So they call her Bloody Mary, because she executed people like Cranmer. Cobbett writes, of course, he has, especially being a Protestant himself, makes the things that he says very powerful. Of course, it's in itself, it's tremendously unfortunate that he never himself became a Catholic, but in a way, it makes the things that he says all the more powerful, because it would be in his interest, being a Protestant, to make Protestantism look good. But what he himself says is that the truth is that the executions ordered during the reign of Mary, in virtue of existing laws, and after a regular form of trial, generally reached a set of most wicked wretches who sought to destroy the queen and her government, and under the pretense of a freedom of conscience, to obtain the means of preying upon the people. So that's from a Protestant. So Pope Julius III died on March 23rd, 1555, so after a pontificate of 5 years, and that was the main event of the end of his reign, of his late reign, was the reconciliation of the Kingdom of England with the Church. So a pope who died when things were actually looking up, which we've seen. There's been so much bad happening that typically hasn't been the case over papacies that we've studied recently. So now we move on to the next papacy. Pope Marcellus II. Who reigned from April 9th, 1555 to May 1st, also 1555. So he was not in for very long. So he was, just a few facts about him. He was Cardinal Marcello Cervini, and took the name Marcellus II, so very close to his Italian name. And again, you see recent popes like Julius III, I recall reading that he was bad with regard to nepotism. But Marcellus II wanted to avoid that, so even the suspicion of it, so he wouldn't allow his relatives to even come to Rome at all after his elevation to the papacy. He reduced the expenditures of the papal court and turned his attention to resuming the Council of Trent, so he had a keen interest in that, which had been adjourned for 2 years at this point, because, and he said to the Cardinal of Mantua that Reformation is the only means, not only of increasing, but even of preserving the pontifical authority. It will abolish only what is superfluous and onerous, luxury, pomp, retinues, with other excessive and useless expense, which bring the papacy into contempt, instead of making it venerable and majestic. By putting an end to these vanities, we shall really increase its power, its reputation and finances, which are the sinews of a government. But what is more, the measure will call down upon the popes the divine help, which they may hope to receive who strive to do their duty. So, based on that quote, seems that he would have done well for looking to continue the Council of Trent and also essentially make the papal court less worldly and more efficient as a government. So just based on that, it looks like he would have done well as pope, but he died on the 22nd day of his pontificate, so he had time to do virtually nothing. So that was Pope Marcellus II, very short reign. And then move on to Pope Paul IV. Who reigned from May 23rd of 1555 to August 18th, 1559. So it was Cardinal Carafa, who was the superior general of the Theatines. You saw the establishment of that order a little while ago, who was elected on the 23rd of May, 1555, and took the name Paul IV. He was already 79 years old when he was elected, but he was still reportedly zealous and vigorous. So he was the man for the job. And see, even so, and he reigned obviously into his 80s. His reign lasted over 4 years. By the abdication of Charles V, which we saw, the imperial crown passed to Ferdinand I, and the hereditary states. So remember that the Holy Roman, the crown of the Holy Roman Empire was not hereditary. That it was, at least under normal circumstances, it was determined by electors, who would be the emperor. But Charles V did hold possessions which were hereditary, and those passed to Philip II, which were Spain, the Netherlands, Burgundy, Naples, Milanese territories, and the New World. So Philip II inherits this huge empire. And also remember, he still has the title King of England. He had that already, even before he inherited all these areas. He had that title because of his marriage with Mary Tudor. And Ferdinand I, and this is a worrying sign, he assumed the imperial title and insignia without even asking confirmation of the Holy See. So popes had always confirmed, yes, they had been elected by the designated electors, but they had also been confirmed by the pontiff, by the sovereign pontiff. In this case, Ferdinand I did not even seek that. He just assumed the role of emperor and whatever functions the emperor had, whatever exercise, whatever power, whatever influence the emperor had without consulting the pope at all. Of course, remember that, does anybody remember when the Holy Roman Empire was first established? Very famous date. Christmas Day of the year 800. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Yes.
Charlemagne?
Yes, exactly. The coronation of Charlemagne. By Pope, anybody? Anybody know who crowned him? I already said Pope. Pope St. Leo III, who is there. I'd have to verify the stories. I'd have to look it up to find out if it's true. But supposedly that they tried to prevent him from crowning Charlemagne, some group of insurrectionists, by putting out his eyes, but they were reported to have been miraculously restored. I'd have to verify that story, but that was written at some point. So whether or not that's true, I'd have to verify. Yes.
Was this around the time of Attila the Hun? Was he the pope that?
That was Pope Saint Leo the Great. That was two Leos earlier. No, this is a different Saint Leo. But it was, yes, Pope Saint Leo III who crowned Charlemagne. So, they started in the first coronation of Holy Roman Emperor was Charlemagne in the year 800, specifically on Christmas Day by Pope St. Leo III. And now we're in the 1550s, and the emperor doesn't even ask the Pope for confirmation anymore, let alone any coronation ceremony. Think anybody else name an emperor who is reported to have crowned himself? Yes. There are different accounts of that ceremony, but he invited the Pope there, and the Pope was present. But he's reported generally to have just put the crown on his own head instead. Very, very much an act of defiance. So remember that the Holy Roman Emperors had always been seen as had always been meant to be, of course not always in fact, but had always meant to be the armed defenders of the Church, of the Catholic Church, because remember that the old Roman Empire became so huge that it was eventually subdivided for ease of administration. The western section fell apart. The eastern section survived as the Byzantine Empire until the fall of Constantinople, which we saw earlier this year. But it meant that the Eastern emperors were always claiming the western section of the empire. In addition, so we're the Roman emperors. Our capital is in Constantinople, but we're still the emperors of the entire empire. And then so the Pope was supposed to say, all right, well, then we'll do something about all these barbarians that are running amok and sacking cities and causing all kinds of trouble, looting, pillaging, and so forth. But they never did anything. They were too caught up in their own power struggles and their own corruption. So nothing ever happened. So the Pope said, fine, we'll crown some other emperor. And that was Charlemagne. So the Eastern emperors were very much upset by that. But the popes wanted somebody to defend the church, and Charlemagne was the best one for the job, so he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. But again, after his death, the Holy Roman Empire quickly, for one thing, he had it himself divided among his sons, and that very much developed into what we think now of as being the modern nation states of Europe. Those areas that he controlled. So again, the Holy Roman Emperor was originally conceived as the defender of the church, crowned by the Pope, always with the approval of the Pope, but now they don't care anymore. So essentially, the Pope had the principal part in the election. He had to confirm the emperor, and now that's just being taken away from him. Not even with his own consent. It's not even like they negotiated about it. Ferdinand's just taking the crown and exercising whatever authority the emperor has at this point. though the abdication of Charles and the succession of Ferdinand had been ratified by the 7 traditional electors, that confirmation was not in any way supposed to, or it was never, the idea was never that you could have confirmation by the Pope or by the 7 electors. The idea was it had to be both of those things. But also at this point, 3 of those electors are heretics. So they probably didn't bother them particularly, to say the least, that the Pope was not involved in this process anymore. Yes.
How many electors were there total?
7. So 3 of the 7 now are heretics. Almost half of them. Which is an odd number, but close to 50% there. So when Ferdinand did send an ambassador actually to Paul IV to not to ask for approval, but to notify him of his master's succession, the Pope, in concert with the cardinals, said that replied that the only way to remove all difficulties would be for Ferdinand to apply to the Holy See, which would supply what was wanting in the mode of election. So he's saying, well, we're not going to congratulate him or anything like that. Something's wrong with his election here. He needs approval, but only by the Pope, and we'd only consider him legitimate if he actually ever asks for that. Diplomatic negotiations were subsequently opened on the subject, but Ferdinand, in the end, recalled his ambassador and determined to do without the Pope's confirmation. And all of his successors followed his example. So this is a big break. Again, the Holy Roman Emperor was, I've said many times, had limited power, limited influence over the area that was considered to be the empire. But still, it was a very important position. And now we have these emperors essentially dispensing themselves, as it were, from confirmation by the Pope. That's significant. So the diplomatic relations between Paul IV and Philip II, who was the heir to the Italian possessions of Charles V, were not much better. So remember, the popes did always have, the church had up until the mid-19th century, temporal possessions for her support, which makes sense. The church always had these possessions, and so the popes were temporal rulers. They were the kings of the papal states. They were, yes, of course, primarily the vicars of Christ on earth, the visible heads of the Catholic Church, etc. But they were at the same time still temporal rulers with the interests of temporal rulers, and that included, they got into political strife, sometimes to the point of something too deeply involved in family feuds, families of which they were themselves members, and then also fighting with other civil rulers, in this case, political clashes with Philip II. So we'll see those later on, in as much as they significantly affect church history.